In this episode, we're talking with property valuer Will Phillips. He's going to share some of the findings from his recent research into the impact of first home buyer incentives on property prices. Do they really help people get into the market, or are they instead making homes less affordable? And what about when governments get involved in lending to first home buyers? Where does the money come from, and who is really benefiting?
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent and buyer's agent mentor, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, author of Auction Ready and co-host of Your First Home Buyer Guide.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker, recently ranked number 5 in Australia out of over 18,000 brokers in the annual MPA Top 100 Mortgage Broker Awards. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of an appropriate and experienced professional.
Our guest today is Will Phillips. Will is a listener who has reached out to us with some very interesting research he's been doing. He's a registered valuer and he's been such for over a decade, working across the country, starting in Brisbane, then Dumbo, Canberra, Roma, Emerald, Gladstone, Perth, and now living in Bunbury, WA. He's just completed a Master of Economics with a 20,000-word dissertation being called The Impact of Government Incentives and Low Deposit Home Loans on the Perth Property Market. This research took him over 18 months to write, and we're pretty excited that he's sharing his findings with us today. Thank you so much for reaching out, Will, and for being a listener too.
No problem. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to the chat, Will. Sometimes before we do these podcasts, we get into some meaty chats prior to starting, and we had to sort of stop you there. It'd be interesting just to know why you, did this research and what your thoughts were prior to doing it. We've got a view of the world or our hypothesis that we do before we start, and what sort of did you learn through the process, and was it what you expected the outcome to be?
Yeah, so I started valuing in Southeast Queensland back at the start of last decade, sort of around 2010 to 2011. And then, as Veronica sort of mentioned, moved around a little bit. So you sort of get a bit of an understanding on how different markets operate, what their drivers are, and you can sort of pick up anything fairly quickly that's a little bit out of the ordinary. And so when I moved over to WA at the start of 2021, there were a few things that I just really quickly sort of picked up in terms of differences, particularly between Queensland and WA. Things like rates of home ownership were quite a bit higher in WA, and in particular certain suburbs. And the cost of construction of a house at the time when I came over was about 30% less than what I was used to sort of seeing on housing construction contracts in Queensland at the time. And so that sort of, prompted me to do a bit more of a deeper dive into what was sort of happening over here.
I'm actually gobsmacked because I've read through some of the stuff you sent us, and I actually hadn't realised, I hadn't picked up on that cost of construction. So it's an interesting one, but we need to tease a lot of this out, right? Because obviously, there's some unique factors that are at play in the Perth market that don't operate elsewhere, but you've touched on higher rates of home ownership. I know that there are government incentives to assist first home buyers to get into the market. So I'm guessing that those incentives, and also there's like mortgage packages and all sorts of things, and hopefully you can explain them all for us. I'm guessing those are to some degree responsible for this higher rate of home ownership. And what is the difference?
Yeah, definitely responsible. So in WA, they have a loan deposit home loan scheme, which is fairly unique to WA. I think South Australia has something similar. But in WA, it's called Keystart, and basically it has a 2% deposit requirement. And there's a couple of other characteristics that we need to satisfy in terms of income limits. There's a purchase price limit, and then it has to be an owner-occupied property as well. And so the government has a $10,000 first homeowners grant, which around 2013, 2014, they changed from being able to be used to purchasing of established properties to only being able to be used to construct a new dwelling. And this $10,000 deposit can be utilised for the 2% deposit for the low deposit home loan.
So that basically means, if I got you right, that a first home buyer, as long as they qualify, with under the income threshold, buying the type of property that obviously brand new under a certain price point, and they've also got the income to sustain a mortgage, that they could actually buy a brand new house without any savings.
Correct.
Right. Okay. So that make it easier to get in the market, obviously.
And so the key here from sort of 2014 onwards was that the homeowner grant was increased from $7,000 to $10,000, and the purchase price limit was $480,000. So 2% of that is $9,600. So effectively, your $10,000 first homeowner grant completely covers your 2% deposit, and you've got some cash in the back pocket as well.
So what construction costs is so much cheaper?
Exactly.
Well, that's sort of as a result of what's happened over the past sort of decade with housing construction. And there was a pretty extreme oversupply of new housing that came on the market after the 2014-15 mining downturn. And the construction industry contracted quite significantly in that time. Went from, I think, a peak of nearly 25,000 completions in 2015 down to about 10,000 completions sort of 2019, 2020. And so as the construction industry was contracting, obviously they were needing to compete against each other to win the opportunity to build new homes, and in doing so, getting down in price.
But materials and the labour, I mean, were they like not making profit on these numbers? I mean, or was it, was there many established players left, or was it just the big end of town? Like, how 30% is a big gap, right? Like to think that you can build a house 30% cheaper, but if it was 30% more expensive, it would be over these sort of thresholds probably, right? So they wouldn't get work. So do you think that the threshold meant that they had to go under these limits to be able to sell stuff?
So there's a few elements to that question. And I think in a downturn, when there's lots of labour around and materials are a bit cheaper, things just, drop in price, basically. And, there's a few reasons, I guess, for that. Like if you talk to any bricklayers that have been, in industry for the last 10 odd years, they'll tell you that between 2017 and sort of 2020, they were, barely making any money. And then the price per bricks for laid over the last couple of years is just, gone up exponentially, sort of thing. And so, what was the second part of that question?
Well, I mean, it just seemed a big gap. I was just wondering if there's, any other government incentive or anything that was, like try to keep the number of the sale price under these limits, right? Because they want to create a mini construction boom. Were they doing anything else? Were they, zoning? Were they making that a bit cheaper, or development fees? Were they like, taking any hits or giving any incentives any other ways to the developer or to a builder, or?
To be honest, I think it was really just demand and supply. And that was just, the margins on it were, paper thin, and you were left with really just the big established builders that had scale. And I've read a government report from around 2012 that sort of runs through how many builders there are in WA compared with the eastern states, and it's a significantly smaller number of established building companies, and they are quite a bit larger, so they have those efficiencies and scale.
When you've been doing this research, Perth is, it's a long way away from the rest of the country. And we've known that there's been, a good decade of really depressed property price growth. And a lot of that in large part was because of the end of the mining boom. And how have you been able to separate or tease out those sort of macro environmental factors that impact the property market from the impacts of the first home buyer grants and the low deposit loan schemes and things like that? How have you, in your methodology, been able to tease those two things apart so that what your findings are, which I know you're going to get to shortly, you can be confident that it really is the incentives that has had the impact?
The way that I sort of identified that was that housing construction in WA didn't really start to ramp up until 2014, which was the beginning of the downturn. And at that point, that's when the mining industry started to free up a lot of labour, and the housing construction industry was able to really sort of get going. Much in the same way as in Brisbane with the unit construction boom. A lot of that labour came from the mining industry in Queensland, and sort of transitioned across to that residential construction of units. And so, yeah, it's just a similar story in WA, where all that labour was freed up, and that's when you really start to see dwelling constructions really get going.
So what you're saying, if I'm putting words in your mouth here, is that as the mining boom ended, the government looked at ways to get more people into housing and continue to, I guess, create an economy which provided employment to people who potentially were displaced by one industry. It's downturn. Is that what you're talking about? You're basically saying that the government then turned to construction to say, right, well, we need to bolster up and get activity going. How are we going to stimulate this side of the market?
Because I wasn't in WA at the time, so I can't really comment on the policy decisions around that. But having lived in Brisbane when the unit construction boom was on, I know that was a bit of a mandate. They did a lot of rezoning to try and incentivise developers to build a lot of those high-rise units in the middle of the city there. But yeah, as far as Western Australia goes, the timing of the changes to some of the incentives and the scheme itself were sort of around that period. But I would only be sort of speculating as to those changes were made at that time.
So
is the home ownership rate you said in Perth, what is that in terms of versus the other states?
The 2021 census, it was around 41% of homes owned with a mortgage. In terms of, and so that's sort of been more of a focus for me as opposed to total ownership, which is inclusive of own outright. It's been more of the mortgage focus. So yeah, it was about 41%, whereas the average for Australia is somewhere in the mid to low 30s.
And you think that that's what then encourage you to do your research to basically show that, this keystart policy pushed a lot of people into home ownership, which we're not saying that's good or bad, but this is just thinking this is why it's much higher than the other state. But these are grouped together, right? This is a glut of people with higher mortgages that are buying these new properties, and they've got to be pretty cheap, right? Like in terms of the build cost and the land to get under 500,000, like they've got to be small blocks and small builds, right? Is that sort of what your takeaway is, that you've then got these glut of suburbs that have high, debt to equity and huge portion have mortgages?
Yeah, so you still have your established inner ring suburbs where it really still is, down to 15 or 20% rates of homes owned with a mortgage, and quite a few around that sort of mid to low 30s as well. And so I analysed every suburb in Greater Perth just to see where the higher rates actually were. And it's in the growth corridors, typically those master planned estates that are sort of 30 to 40 kilometres out of the city.
And so what conclusions have you come to? Is this good for Perth residents that they are able to get into housing a lot easier than elsewhere in the country? I mean, obviously with cheaper prices, you would expect that's the case as well. But obviously with the government lowering the barrier to entry, is that a good thing? Has that meant that there's, more stability and people are actually more secure financially? Or is it actually a is it, I guess, exposing a whole segment of homeowners to quite a dangerous situation? I'm not quite sure how we should interpret this.
Yeah, and I'm sort of denied with it myself, and I try not to sit on the fence, because typically as valuers and analysts, we're providers of a story and a report, as opposed to providing an opinion. I think that there's an element, certainly, that providing people with an opportunity to have home ownership is definitely a good thing, because it does provide that stability. There's also the other side of the coin, with WA being at a commodity-based economy, where up to sort of 45 and even 50% of the economic output does come from the mining sector. You do need an element of labour mobility to be able to bring in workers when there's a bit of a mining boom on. And then if things do start to sort of cool off, they might sort of move around to other locations around the country where that labour is then required. So that's sort of the two sides of that coin, really. But it does bring in a few other things as well, in terms of, because the properties can only be owner-occupied, you can't sort of, if you're at a point where you want to relocate into state and retain that property, but you don't have 5%, 10 or 20 to transition across to another lender, you then may need to sell it and realise a loss, or potentially you sort of do need to hang on to it if there is a negative equity stake in it.
Is that your experience though? So Perth had some pretty big numbers showing at a city level, and then when you go into some suburbs and then types of properties, some growth has been quite serious, some quite significant growth in the last 2 years. What's your take on a lot of these suburbs that you analysed that have used Keystart, that are have purchased under this 500 limit, and likely they've gone in there with 100% loans, because they're probably, it's called 98, pretty much 100%, right? Have they had significant growth? Have they done really well financially, or is there negative equity? So, or what's the issue?
So one of the analysis that I undertook, and I'll refer to some suburbs in Queensland, because I know that market fairly well. I use that as a bit of a basis of comparison. So I analysed some suburbs in the city of Swan, LGA, which is the north-east growth corridor of Perth, and I've compared them with 5 suburbs based in southeast Queensland around the Springfield area, because they're both sort of similar distances from the city, similar levels of growth in terms of dwelling and population. And when comparing the two, the 5 suburbs in southeast Queensland have pretty standard, or closer to the average rate of homes owned with a mortgage, compared with the ones in the LGA, city of Swan. And what I found was the additional demand, when the incentives were changed for the first homeowners around 2014-15, the relationship between the price of new dwellings and the price of the most likely substitute being a dwelling that's aged 1 to 5 years old actually inverted, whereby the cost of construction of a new dwelling became more expensive than purchasing a house that had been recently completed. And most people, you might sort of think, well, a brand new house should be more expensive, but what you've got to consider is that you've also got rental accommodation costs for the period of construction. You might need to start paying interest on your loan as it's being drawn down through that construction period as well. And so when I did this same analysis for the suburbs in southeast Queensland, you find that relationship between established houses and new dwelling construction costs is actually the established houses are more expensive. And so what that basically means is that once you construct a new house in WA, because there's a premium for new dwelling construction, you're instantly in a position where the day you walk through the front door, your house is worth less than what it cost you to build it.
So I'm gathering from that, sort of joining the dots, that by incentivizing, so you're drawing a connection between the incentives effectively propping up the prices of new, which is what we would expect. But so you're actually saying that you've got evidence now that this is actually what happens, that the new is bolstered by the fact that there are incentives encouraging people into that segment of the market. Because the thing is that if you've got people that can buy brand new with zero savings, but they're locked out of the established market, so the established market doesn't have access to that buyer pool, then it sort of stands to reason that the established market would suffer somewhat because it doesn't have those buyers competing for it. Does that make sense? Is that something that you've found?
And the result of that, to a degree, is because of the way that, you're right, the incentives are set up. So the $10,000 has to be used for the construction of a new dwelling. There was a $3,000 grant for purchasing of an established dwelling, but that was taken away in around that same sort of period. And there's a stamp duty concession as well. And around that similar sort of period, that was reduced from $500,000 to $430,000 for if you're purchasing an established property. And then it's a bit of a sliding scale going up to $430,000. So you still do get a bit of a concession. Whereas if you're constructing a new house, the stamp duty concession applies to anything on land up to $300,000. So you can get a lot closer to that $480,000 purchase price limit by building a new house than you can by purchasing an established house, even without the $10,000 grant.
Yeah.
And so I did do a bit of analysis just on sale price bands. And yeah, you do say it's not statistically significant, but it does show a bit of a trend in terms of, properties that sell just below that $430,000 price point for established, where you can see that people are really trying to make use of that stamp duty concession.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the new dwellings, the volume of dwellings constructed above, once you get that sort of purchase price limit, the volume really drops away.
And so with this recent boom, though, has those suburbs gone up, or are they now still in negative equity? Because you can already imagine, okay, so they've moved in, they paid $480,000. You're just saying that as soon as they moved in, it's not worth $480, it's worth maybe closer to $430 because it's established property now. And there was stamp duty concessions up to that. And if your target market's first home buyers, a lot of them looking for those sort of concessions. And there's always and people do want new over old, so why would you want a 1-year-old place when you could buy a new one for the same price if you've got rental accommodation? And everything's fresh, the paint's fresh, etc. And that's one of the challenges with estates. There's always a newer estate just down the road, like there's and that buyer's always got the choice of 1-year-old or 3 years or brand new. But now then you fast forward 3 years, are these suburbs really still struggling? Like where they thought they got home ownership, but what they really got was an asset that didn't go up in value, that was actually quite risky. They haven't really saved money on renting because their mortgage rates have gone up. And so what have they really got out of this? Yes, they're homeowners, but are they stuck? Are they actually mortgage prisoners now? And they've seen very little growth, or have they gone up? I don't know, like because the construction costs have gone up, and they actually were just that construction cost benefit is really now factored into higher prices. So they've made money not because of good assets, just because construction costs have gone up and they bought at the right time.
Yeah, so I guess that really comes down to an individual level in terms of when they bought, what they paid, and those sorts of things. I did do an analysis on the negative equity positions of participants, and assumed a starting construction cost as the maximum purchase price of $480, and then had an established dwelling, so the value of the property on completion. And used the average median price of the suburbs over the period following that through the downturn to sort of track the payments, the repayments on the loan, and also to track the median sale prices of that area. And it did result in, that position of negative equity for quite a few years. And then it sort of, I think, turned around from memory, maybe around 2020, 2021. There was sort of enough growth where they paid off enough and the growth then turned around to put them back into that position of negative equity. And I also did that analysis as well with a 5% deposit just to see what the difference was. And with the 5% deposit, you sort of dip in and out of negative and positive equity quite a number of times over that same period. And I think, the first time was within a couple of years, as opposed to having to wait 4 or 5 years to get back to that positive equity position.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So it's a long time, right? So that person did enter. They sort of fell for the incentive. They got into a mortgage, but for 5 years, they sort of realized that this hasn't gone up in value. And if they did sell in that period, some people would have lost money. So that potentially you would see people who've gone under, right? Because if they sold it, they had a mortgage at 98% on 480, so let's say a 470 mortgage, and they sold it for 450, less costs. Did they have to fund that money? Like, is there any story there where you saw a lot of people who did have to move because they could only get keystart if they stayed in it, right? So if they had to move to Brisbane for work, they had to sell it. Is there a story on the ground where people had to, basically walked away and lost more, went bankrupt or went under? Like, what's the situation?
Yeah, because I wasn't over here through that period, I can't really sort of comment. But from what I've heard, either anecdotally or through reading different news articles and through the media, I think Keystart did generally try to work with participants of the scheme to try and come to a resolution with them. So I don't know exactly what those resolutions were, and I probably don't want to speculate in case that I am wrong, but I know Keystart really does try and work with its participants. I know on the outcome that, it works with the parties involved.
One of the findings that you have listed through in a sort of a summary that we got from you was that suburbs with higher rates of homes owned with a mortgage appear to have higher rates of long-term unemployment. Now, that's a really interesting, is that correlation, causation? What do you think is going on there? And do you think that is unique to Perth?
I'm not really a social or demographic economist. I'm more sort of property related. So in terms of that data, really what I was looking at was the high rate of home over the mortgage suburbs and the unemployment rates, and just comparing the 2011 census with the 2021 census data. It did indicate that the higher rates of home owned with the mortgage suburbs did actually have higher rates of unemployment in 2021 in some cases, not all, than they did in 2011. Whereas if you look at those suburbs, the more established suburbs with the rates of homes owned with the mortgage, closer to the average, you're down in the 20%. In a lot of cases, the rate of unemployment actually decreased between 2011 and 2021. But yeah, as I said, I'm not a social or demographic economist, so someone else need to pick up that research and do it with a bit more confidence.
It's quite fascinating though, because where my mind goes when sort of I read those sort of findings is I think about, the GFC in America, how it hit the property market over there was so smashed because of effectively low doc loans, and you're able to hand the keys back if you can't pay the mortgage, and people who didn't have jobs were able to get mortgages, et cetera, et cetera. And I know that even with this situation, which is helping people get into the property market, it's not saying if you don't have a job you can get a mortgage. I know that it's a completely different banking system. However, there is something to be said for a barrier to entry, right? Now, we talk about affordability, we talk about our social problems in this country about people not being able to afford to get into the housing market and what that means. But the problem is that once you get into the housing market, you have an obligation to continue paying your mortgage, et cetera, et cetera. So and then if you can't get out of that property safely and securely, you face with negative equity and the problem of trying to sell the loss and all of those sorts of things, right? So so where my mind goes, and I know that you just said you're not so you're not a that type of economist, but like, don't you get curious about why? Does your mind go to a couple of theories and a couple of scenarios as to what potentially could be the cause of this or what's going on, or are you quite happy just to find the findings and then move on and see what else you can uncover.
I did read a few peer-reviewed journal articles that do suggest that home ownership and reductions in labour mobility could lead to long-term unemployment rates increasing. So that was sort of where the basis of that finding came from. But yeah, it's really hard to know exactly what the cause of was, whether it was just a structural change in employment because of, people in that area were employed in a certain industry that, is no longer existing. And, sort of be because of that and nothing to do with the rates of homes owned with a mortgage. So there's really, more research that needs to be done to be confident with that.
Yeah, so potentially that they had less ties to an area, whereas in a more established area, people have got more ties, they've been there a lot longer, they might found employment after living in the area as opposed to moving to an area because they found employment. You know what I mean? That's sort of that order in which people might do that. It often concerns me. The worst case scenario of this is really, or example of this is a mining town where people have moved to a mining town because that's where their job is, and then they're left, right? It's left investors devastated, but owner-occupiers would have been, I imagine, as well if they'd gone and actually bought into some of those towns where the mine's shut, for argument's sake. So that's at one extreme. So potentially, are you suggesting that these articles that you've read, and I know we go down an area that's not your research, but I just think that the story is bigger than just simply looking at the data. Like you say, if you don't really know the reason, I'm looking at what other questions can we ask of this?
So the first thing that I'll probably touch on is Queensland is a commodity-based economy as well. It's more diversified in where its economic output does come from. It doesn't have such a high reliance on mining. But one of the other key differences between Queensland and WA is that Queensland has a lot of cities or towns outside of Brisbane. And so a lot of the population lives outside of Brisbane. So when they go through a bit of a mining boom, and a lot of the work is to actually locate themselves in, Emerald, Gladstone, Rockhampton, Mackay, Townsville, Cairns. There's quite a few cities around the place other than Brisbane. Whereas in WA, outside of Perth, you've sort of got Geraldton and Bunbury, Busselton down south, but and a few sort of towns down further, Albany. But you really don't have that population density outside of Perth. So when people do come over, it does put a bit of pressure onto the capital city market than it does, say, in Brisbane, where Queensland's going through a bit of a mining boom. And you touched on vacancy rates and the population data. So interstate migration definitely went into deficit following the mining downturn 2014-15. But if you look at WA's population as a whole, it actually never decreases over that period. It still sort of maintains and increases through international migration and natural increases through things like births. And where the vacancy rates actually came from is with all the labour being released from the mines in 2014, 15, 16, you really see a huge spike in dwelling construction. And I really feel that the vacancy rate is actually as a result of building too many dwellings too quickly. And so you see after the buying downturn, the vacancy rate in this area starts to approach 3%, which is what we've got to consider a balanced market where rents, stay fairly stagnant, might increase a little bit. And again, going back and sort of looking at the southeast Queensland suburbs, once that vacancy rate sort of approaches and goes 3% up towards 4%, it then sort of moderates and then comes back down again. As new dwelling supply sort of pulls back a little bit, and then once it falls below 3%, but the asking rents start to increase, and investors start to re-enter the market and build some new houses. And owner-occupiers, they decide, well, rent is just gone up in price, let's build a house now. So you get that natural increase in supply. Whereas over here, when you remove the investor element from the market, and you've long before about barriers to entry, Well, investors that owner-occupiers buy or build properties for totally different reasons. Investors build, pretty much based on quantitative figures, asking rents, rental yields, capacity to carry gearing, tax deductions, all those factors, and then looking at vacancy rates, infrastructure spending in the area. It's a really analysed decision. Whereas for owner-occupiers, they go, well, we just want a backyard with like a patio, so we can have some barbecues. We've got friends around the corner. We want to put our kids in that school. Let's build a house here. And so what we saw was, as vacancy rates went through that 3% over here in WA, removing the investors from that market and having the supply driven by owner-occupiers meant that it didn't really have that self-regulation ability to it. And so for a period of I think it was about 2.5 years, the vacancy rate just continued to climb. And it went 3%, 4%, 5%, all the way up to 7.5% in these suburbs that I've sort of looked at in the northeast corridor, which really is getting to the point where owner-occupiers have to go, we can rent a house for, basically nothing. It actually makes no sense to build another one. But it's not until you get to that extreme level of oversupply that you reach that point where that sort of starts to happen.
I'm on a personal mission to help more people make better property decisions. And you can find out all about what I'm working on at veronicamorgan.com.au. And there you'll find resources for first home buyers, details about my buyer's agent mentoring program, access to suburb help for investors, or if you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or lower North Shore, you can connect with my team at Good Deeds Property Buyers.
If you're thinking about buying your first home, upgrading to a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, we would love to carefully guide you through this journey and importantly get the finance right. Please reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Don't forget that you can download our free full or forecaster report. Which experts can you trust to get it right? theelephantintheroom.com.au.
What are your thoughts on the current, popularity of Perth for investors? Because obviously things have changed. The vacancy rate is not like it was, so there's obviously opportunity to rent properties out there. At the moment, we're seeing some movement on prices. I mean, I'm talking broadly here. So therefore, people are starting to see that there's some potentially some gains to be made. So what are your thoughts about that shift in investor sentiment with regards to Perth at the moment?
So one of the things that I tracked as well was the share of WA's new investor activity for housing and the percentage difference between the Perth median house price and the Sydney median house price. And I've overlaid onto a graph, and what you can see is when the WA share of new investor activity starts to increase, and it's got a long-term average around 10%, and this is ABS data, the percentage difference between the median house prices of Perth and Sydney starts to decrease all the way up to 2006, 2007, when the percentage of new investor activity in Western Australia was 21% as a share of all of Australia, which is twice the long-term average. And the difference between the median house price in Perth and Sydney got down to 1%. And it's sort of settled a bit below 20, but still above the long-term average for quite a period of time through to the second mining boom. And then following that, once they had the extreme sort of oversupply of dwellings, it dropped to as low as sort of 3 to 4% as a share of new investor dwelling housing activity. And so over the past sort of few years, I think 2019 is when it actually troughed out at its lowest rate. And the difference between the Perth and Sydney median house price was about 60%. And so it started to trend back down again. And over the last calendar year, 2023, the share has increased from 7% to 9%. So we're definitely starting to see investors re-enter the market and track back up towards that long-term average of 10%.
Yeah. And did you, I know you're meant to do an opinion as the valuer, but, on a podcast, nothing to do with where you work or, your opinion only. I mean, what have you learned around what assets perform well, where the risk lies, the risk for return work, doesn't really exist, it's not really worth the risk for the return. Like if you're investing your own money, like what are the rules that you sort of live by and what's your property philosophy?
So before I left Brisbane back in 2017, I actually spent a bit of time working as a buyer's agent and learned, some really good baseline information. And I actually wrote a couple of pages just in Word. And whenever a friend asks me, for some advice on buying a property, I send them that first. And it's all stuff like, buy on the high side of the street, buy west facing, if it's been renovated, you want to be lived in for a couple of years. Don't buy a T intersection because you get headlights in your front window. Like just all these basic sort of things that just elevate a property from that, even a B or a B plus up into that sort of A grade level. But one of the things that I learned that while I was there was that you didn't really mind in terms of what the buyer profile was, whether they were an investor or an owner-occupier. We were just trying to buy them an owner-occupier property. And so the brief might be different. The owner-occupier, they might have we want to have a backyard and a covered decks of barbecues and live across from a park. And then the investor, they might be, this is our budget, this is our borrowing capacity and our ability to carry gear. And that might be the same property to fit both of those briefs. But other times it's sort of made up as well. So I guess my philosophy is whether you're sort of looking to purchase an investment property or owner-occupier property, because such a substantial portion of the market is owner-occupiers, up around 60% when you include own with a mortgage home outright. That's where you're probably going to get most of your capital growth, because that's going to be who the biggest proportion of people looking to purchase your property when it's time to sell. So if you can appeal to that market segment, you've got a better opportunity to find a buyer or a couple of buyers that might even compete against each other.
I mean, that's obviously very much in line with our philosophy as well. It's owner-occupiers that drive up prices. There's owner-occupier demand, I should say, that drives up prices. But the thing, going back to Perth, though, I mean, the problem with that in that market is that you've got owner-occupiers incentivized to buy something that isn't necessarily going to translate to have that same owner-occupier appeal on the resale. So is there something that you sort of applying what you learned when you were working in Southeast Queensland versus what you are observing now that you're living over on the West Coast? Is there a different dynamic at play there in terms of that, that focus on the owner-occupier appeal? Is there two different types of owner-occupiers?
I think the activity that we've probably seen from East Coast buyers over here at the moment has been for established properties. And when you sort of live over here for a period of time or work in property, you can work out the age of a property or something that's been built in the last sort of 20 years very quickly, because it's either built to a downturn or it's quite large in scale. It's got multiple living areas. It's well fitted out with ducted air, high ceilings, stone tops. Because in the downturn, the labour's a bit cheaper, the materials are a bit cheaper. Or it's been built in a burden where the floor areas are a little bit smaller, might be by living space, standard height ceilings, and those sorts of things. And I think owner-occupiers typically, they are looking for the multiple living areas and try to tick all those higher end features. Whereas I guess for investors, particularly East Coast investors that haven't been over here to see the market but potentially don't understand the differences and had maybe a buying purely based on a numbers game in terms of rental yield, may not understand those variables. And So when you're pricing the value of a house purely on its rental yield, there's potential there that you may be actually overpricing the property. And when I'm not going to say when, but should WA cool off a little bit, and you were to then try and sell that property and sell it back into the owner-occupier market, you might find that you might have paid a little bit of a premium because the basis that you bought for is now not the basis that the next buyer is looking to purchase it based on.
Yeah. So I guess you're highlighting a bit of a risk of, buying from afar and not then, understanding the difference in build quality. You're basically just looking at the suburb medium and going, we're not comparing the floor plans and all the features and, the better streets to the worst streets. I mean, you did rattle off a whole list of small 1%ers, I would call it. But, those 1%ers add up, right? Don't buy on the T set. You buy with a better aspect. You buy on the right side of the road. You buy something with, slightly bigger block, or the house is in the right part of the block. Like, and then when you try to sell it in a hot market, yeah, okay, maybe there's not much gap in those prices, right? Because buyers are just desperate and they're willing to make all those compromises. But you're right, when that market cools off at some point, if you do need to sell in that market, that those 1%ers add up. Oh, I'd love it, but I think I'll just be a bit patient. I think I'll just sit on the sidelines for a bit longer because, it's just a bit weird, the floor plan, and I think I'll find something that better suits. And so is that what you're sort of suggesting here, is that the investors come over to Perth, oh, okay, it's got a great yield, it's $500 a week and it's $600,000. It's how amazing is it? But they're not factoring in all those other things that they're missing just because they're buying in a bit of a mini boom based on yield.
I think unless you're a local or you're using a local buyer's agent, it wouldn't matter where you're buying, whether it was Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Broken Hill, wherever. There's going to be nuances that you just cannot know unless you are local to that market.
Yeah.
We are definitely, on board with you on that one. And one of the things that you said that was really just piqued my interest was about in a downturn, the build quality is better. You got more house is being built to attract buyers, I presume. And also, as you said, I think, labour is perhaps cheaper and maybe materials are cheaper, so therefore they can. Whereas in a hotter market, in an upturn, there's more, I guess you got more buyers around, so therefore they're not as fussy, and so therefore you can build smaller houses and potentially with lesser materials or lesser finishes. Have I got that right? Because in a way, that's an extrapolation of what we talk about with, the buyers becoming very fussy in a slow market. Those 1%ers count because buyers have choice. I'm not going to go for the house on the intersection or on a main road in a slow market because I don't have to. Whereas when FOMO is driving the market, when there's lots and lots of activity and when prices are rising rapidly, buyers will compromise on all sorts of things to get into the market. So you sort of applied that same sort of logic in the build side of things, which I've never thought of in that way, which I think that's quite interesting. And once again, that's one of those local knowledge things that I'd never really think of that now. And I'm sure most other East Coasters wouldn't think of that when they're looking at buying in Perth.
Yeah, it really compresses the market from the top to the bottom, and you don't sort of have the premiums between the A and B grade properties. And so you probably don't sort of realise, I guess, when it does turn into a buyer's market, that premium between your property and the A grade property would actually decompress, become a bit larger. Yeah.
No, we see it all the time, but I hadn't thought of it in terms of actually as things are being built. Do you, well, it's been a very interesting conversation. We really appreciate, you, as I said, as a listener, reaching out to us and saying, look, you've done this research. It certainly piqued our interest. Do you have an example of a property, Dumbo, you're going to share with us?
Yeah, I've sort of ummed and ahed with this one, and I didn't want to throw anyone under the bus or implicate anyone too much, but I've got a family member and the older couple, and he's a builder, a master builder, does fantastic work, but he decided he wanted to close a balcony, which looks great, extended the living area, and he probably gets where this is going, and put in a second bathroom into the house as well. And he has done a fantastic job. It looks really great. And they went to sell that property just recently, put it on the market, didn't have it signed off, their final certificates, found a buyer who signed the contract, and then found out that it wasn't signed off, didn't have the final approvals, went to go through that process, really struggled to find a certifier. Sale ended up falling over, and that was about a year and a half ago. And probably still hasn't sold.
Ouch.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, that's one of those things we were just talking about in a hot market, right? Hot market, the buyer just takes it on the chin and says, "Look,
Exactly.
I'm better to be in. Otherwise, I'll just sort that out myself, and I'll pass the buck down the road one day in 10 years' time when I sell it." But in a slow market, people just pull out, right? When there's and they worry there's going to be more things, right? That's the issue. What else isn't signed off? What does this mean? The uncertainty of that just really turns people away. So what should they have done, I guess? Had they just got approval for that and got it all certified properly?
Yeah, you really need to tick that box right from the start. Because after the fact, if you're getting a certifier out there, particularly if you're putting on an extension with, say, a concrete slab or a deck with, concrete footings, the certified, how can they know how deep that concrete is and whether it's in the ground to the required specifications? So it really does pay to do all that beforehand. And even if you're willing to accept it because maybe they would pick it up a little bit cheaper, you've potentially got risk there in terms of, if that deck fails or if that wall of that house falls over for one reason, and it may not even be poor construction, it's just the timber rotted out or something, but then they're going to come back and ask for that certification document, and you don't have it, and you're potentially liable if that's an investment property or you've got a bunch of friends out for a barbecue.
Right.
And possibly having difficulties insuring it as well. It is, as Chris said, it's something that in a hot market buyers will overlook, and I'm always astounded at that because I have been a sales agent. That's when I learned about the folly of trying to ask for ask for forgiveness, not approval, which is what we will try to do after the event. The folly of that is that, yes, you lose your opportunity to sell in any market conditions because that's when people get super picky about this sort of stuff. And I'm never cease to be amazed at how in a hot market, people don't seem to care. And I'm thinking, only you'd actually experience how difficult it can be to move a property that isn't properly approved in a slower market. You would not be so gung-ho about buying this one.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I'm sad to hear that your relative, the elder gentleman with who's the master builder, didn't know any better. I didn't actually know the order in which to get things done. Well, thank you again for reaching out to us. We wish you, now that you've got your masters, congratulations. And are you going to continue working as a valuer, or have you got other plans?
Yeah, so the masters was actually a master of agriculture and resource economics. So the intention was to transition away from residential and move into agribusiness, rural valuations, which is what I've been doing for the past couple of years. It just so happened that sort of fell into this research in moving over here and going to do my dissertation on a residential topic. But yeah, certainly working in agribusiness valuations at the moment and planning on continuing down that path for some time.
Excellent. Well, good luck with your progression of your career.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the chat, Will.
If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming Q&A episode, you can send us a voicemail or written question via the website, theelephantintheroom.com.au, or you can email us directly at questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au. If you like what you're hearing, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars would be great. I know that sounds a bit cringy, but we have it on good authority that every review helps make it easier for other people to find out about us and hear what our amazing guests have to say.